Hey, welcome. Ken and I are going to be discussing different topics that we think are relevant today surrounding tech and AI. And we're probably also going to approach life and business. And you're along for the ride.
Yeah, my name's Ken Cato. I'm from Nova Scotia, Canada. I am absolutely fascinated with life and business and how it all basically flows together. I hope that some of the discussions that we have over the next few days, weeks, months, years to come will help enlighten you and guide you towards a better dream life. That's kind of why we're here today, is to help guide and direct based on what we think is neat, what we're doing ourselves, and hopefully you can take the 2 cents from that and choose how you please.
Perfect. Yeah. And myself, I'm Darren Hind. I'm based out of the UK. I love everything about tech. AI has just always been on my radar. First started with passion with maths. And when studying at university, maths was always one of those things that you just do once a quarter. And when machine learning came along, everything just kind of like slid into place. So I know one of my most passionate subjects. So we're just going to dive in today. Again, I'm going to start with my first one and I'm going to jump into a big one. So we're going to talk about open source projects, turning from open source to commercial. So have you heard about any of like these big stories in the last 8 months?
Are they Web3 based?
No, they're not Web3 based.
Then no, I don't.
All right. So
Wait, well, I shouldn't say right. Hugging Face. I heard Hugging Face has been crushing it. I love what they're doing over there from an open source standpoint. I guess the other open source thing would be what Meta just released a few days ago with Sam 2. That's another thing. I digress. I'm more well versed in the Web3 space, but I do know a lot what's going on.
so in the open source projects I'm mainly talking about are quite big in terms of cloud infrastructure. So this is why they
Okay.
had a bigger impact. So one is Terraform. So just so you understand what Terraform is, it's infrastructure as code. So what does that mean? That means you can write pretty much how your services will look on AWS as code and then deploy it. And it'll deploy all those services exactly how you've configured by code. You don't have to go through GUI. And the good thing is you can use like versioning control. So Terraform was the first one, that used that. And it was a very loved framework for about 11 years. And they kind of came out last year and said, we are changing our license from open source to, I can't remember, it's business something, but essentially what it means is if you use Terraform for beyond, I think it's 100 deployments for different infrastructures, you have to pay Terraform for that right. And it's just because what was happening is like AWS or these cloud providers was using Terraform to deploy servers, and Terraform wasn't really getting much money from that. So they kind of jumped in and closed it off. And there was a big split because now you can imagine about maybe 50% of like AWS engineers were using Terraform to manage the infrastructure as code. And now you've gone from open source to saying, well, you might need to pay for this now. So there was a big hoo-ha. People didn't know what was going to happen. So what one set of people did is they split the branch because it's all open source on GitHub. So you can literally just what we call fork. So you make,
Forking, yeah.
yeah,
ETH did the forking as well.
yeah. And literally they made a new one called Open Tofu. A lot of people are very hesitant for a very long time to make the jump because you don't know if it's going to be supported or
Or
anything.
how open it will stay.
Well, I think this one would be more open because that was the whole point of the jump. It was kind of chaos for a bit. So a lot of people stayed on Terraform 1.7. So that was like the open source version you could stay on without being like penalized for going above certain thresholds. So that's where a lot of people stayed, and they've kind of waited to see what's happening with the Terraform and Open Tofu sort of war going on at the moment.
Sounds just like what's happening in a different area of Dungeons and Dragons. I'm not sure if you knew anything about what's going on there, but they had their own little scandal, which was basically identical to what you described. They allowed anyone to kind of use the content how they pleased, and a lot of content creators made a whole living off creating guides and adventures for other people. And they kind of decided to change the contract a little bit, and it kind of created a major uproar in the Dungeons and Dragon community to the point where it fractured it. New franchises have been created because of it, and Dungeons and Dragons is no longer the the king, you could say. It's now tabletop games because people want to get past the thought of, okay, all these games are Dungeons and Dragons, but it really should be tabletop. And their licensing agreement, the little scandal they decide to do, really painted the picture in a very clear and unpositive light of where the industry was going, especially what Wizard of the Coast wanted to do and Hasbro. And unfortunately, greed was the main priority. And I think it fractured the whole industry itself, but I think it rebirthed something new. I look at some of my favorite content creators, like Dungeons for Dungeons Dragons would be Critical Role. They created a whole new game called Daggerheart, right? That probably never would have got created if this whole scandal didn't happen a few years ago. And it's been an ongoing thing. But I digress down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think you made a good point. Sometimes with chaos comes opportunity. So, like you're saying, like was it Dragon Heart or
Daggerheart.
oh,
It's still in beta right now, I think, or maybe they did release it, but I haven't had a chance to play it yet. You need to find other people to play it with. I've been playing still Dungeons and Dragons 5e, but it's something I wouldn't mind hopping into and trying.
yeah? So I think with chaos comes opportunity for others to kind of branch out and actually take that
Yeah.
leap. Because you might have had that thought, and it's like, well, there's always Dungeons and Dragons. Why should I do this? But now it's like people are upset. Well, maybe this is a good time. So, and I think it's the same with Terraform. Like, there's been other infrastructure of code services. Is the other one? It's not decorative, so it doesn't. So you have to kind of be careful with the deployment. So, if you've deployed it once, you can't just deploy it again because it will redeploy those same fields, and it doesn't match. So you have to be kind of careful with it, but it's still a really good service to use. There are ways to get around that, but I just haven't touched much with Bloomy, so don't take my word on everything for that. But what I was just trying to say is it's interesting that people do kind of like tend to their favorites, and having these
It's the trust. They earn the company has earned merit over the years of goodwill and faith, and when you break that trust, it's really hard to get back.
Yeah, but the thing is, Terraform is being, I think games is something else that's like I love, but like when you in production environments, you can't take chances. So you kind of have to stick with stuff that works. And Terraform's been tested for like 11, 13 years. So many people didn't really want to shift. So they just stayed on that 1.7, like I was saying. And also Terraform, funny enough, got bought by IBM. I think it was early this year.
Oh
So
wow, that's a big Oh, I remember reading that headline.
yeah, so a lot of people are like wondering if that the news of closing it off was because of that merger and try to kind of what's the word keep
Monetized.
well monetize, but also like kind of cut their IP so they can own it because it was like I think if they do the merger, it's like you're buying an open source software. What are you actually buying? And I think by putting that in, kind of cuts it off. So, and another big one that also did something very similar is Redis. So, you know what Redis is?
I You're gonna have to educate me.
Right. We call it a key value store. So think of it like you've got ID2, and then the value of that would be, say, fish or whatever you want to name it. So it's just like you got your key and your value. And Redis is a way that you can like cache certain results. So you can have this was the result and this is the value. So it's just a nice way of just quickly caching things. People can use it for a lot of different other things like rate limiting and stuff like that. But what's interesting is Redis has gone through a lot of iterations. When it started off, the owner wanted it to be open source. And he kind of, through the years, slowly kind of like let other people start running the company. And he actually sold the company to a private company, but still said no, Redis would be open source even after they purchased it. And I can't remember what the company was called, but they changed their name to make it Redis. And last year as well, they also decided they commercializing their product too. But now Redis is a very common used database essentially, again, across the cloud because it's really great for caching. Or so you generally want to use it for, say you use a query, someone queries your database quite often for certain fields, and you don't always want to like have that running and retrieving that data. You just want to like save that result. And Redis is a good way to kind of just save that information. So think of it like you always look at orders for every day, but you don't want to run that query each time. So you'll just like save it to your Redis store and have that key value pair. So when you ask for that, I just grab that data for you. So it's like a quicker response time and it's less
Gotcha.
like strain on like the big databases. So when they did that, there was a huge fallout. And a lot of these big cloud providers got together and made a new Redis. I'm trying to remember what it was called. I put it down here. So Redis, they made,
It's kind of like a neat little war between open source and closed source of as one gets taken down, the people strike back.
well,
Empire strikes back.
so Redis is interesting because it's different from like Terraform. Redis was more like the big corporates, so like AWS, Azure, and those kind of guys coming together and pooling their resource into open source community to support an alternative. So like literally it kind of like stumbled Redis's plans. Redis was like, okay, we're going to do this change and we'll get a lot more like revenue coming in. And the big companies literally just took that. It's like, well, we'll just fork this and make our own product that's very similar and maintain it differently. So we don't have to pay this license. So I know the reason why I'm going down this whole chain of like going open source to like, paid versions and putting walls in place is because we're kind of in an interesting space right now with AI. There's a lot like a war between open source and closed source models, closed source being the open AI. But a lot of models right now to get publicity coming from open source, like Llama is like the biggest one. Like they're really pushing open source. But again, these models are very expensive to use. Like you're not paying to use them, they're free. It's not like you can really just like grab the code. It's you still need to train them. So it's a little bit of a different structure, but it's like how long is this going to last until there's a wall that's just chucked in all of a sudden?
It has to be chucked in for survivability, and unless they get more funding rounds. And how many funding rounds do you go?
So yeah, so again, it's like I guess it's how many interests are you keeping aligned by actually giving these open source models and people that will fund you so you don't drop. Like Mistral did a very good open source run. They did most of their first models were all open source, and they slowly closed sourced it out to try and get revenue. So it's saying it was an interesting trend from last year, and it's kind of interesting what will happen with the years coming.
I don't think it's going to change so much. And the reason why I think that is because it's a business model. You get people to come in and build on your stuff for free, get them built. Basically, they're building you the assets as well, essentially. So you're getting free labor, essentially, trying to not only. It's kind of like the way I see the insurance industry, where they get you with one thing, they try to get you with another thing and another thing. So once you have multiple assets built upon what you're trying to do, they relatively have you because it's difficult to switch, as you mentioned earlier. No one wants to switch because they've been on it for so long. I think it's just more of a business model, to be truthful. It's easy to get people to adopt your technology, and then they don't want to switch because they already like it. So yes, you're going to have some churn, but the people that you do keep are going to be loyalists.
So there are a lot of companies like that start off like especially the YC Combinator companies started as open source and they have their free version to a point, so they keep that free and they add additional features that are commercial and that's like you have access to.
That's another brilliant business model right there.
You know,
I think everyone's going to have their own cup of tea of how they want to do. Interesting enough, this is something that I'm going to be talking about is different asset allocations and understanding how basically companies will be evolving. I think with decentralization, with Web3, with the new methodologies for peer-to-peer transaction through knowledge or assets, a lot of radical shifts are being presented over time as more and more infrastructure is built.
so
But
maybe you just jump into your points like on that train of thought then that you were talking about.
Yeah, well, I like to think about what we have. I like to introduce you to something I call THAAD. It is an acronym, basically stands for time allocation, and you're going to see the words prop up: time allocation, human capital allocation, asset allocation, and digital allocation. And these are, in my opinion, the four pillars that really encompasses all reality. Everything you can basically, from a first principle standpoint, stem from this information, or keep it as like a library, you could say, or a warehouse. And with these basically funnels, you can really understand different economies. So my favorite economies I like to think about is the creator economy, because there's many different ones. There's the attention economy, and we can focus on different ones at different days. But for today, I would like to talk about the creator economy because when I really think about where things are going and how we're in the AI plus robotic era, a lot of the human allocation standpoint is going to be shifting. And some of the biggest things I like to think about is the redefinition of creative work and content production, because what the humans can do versus robotic and AI can do is on the spectrum of extremes, essentially. From cognitive base all down to creative. I think humans are not prepared or truly don't understand for what is coming. The other thing is the economical impact of the labor market just distribution, because now you have, like, let's say hypothetically, in the next 2 years, Elon Musk sticks to his word and he has Optimus rolling off the line by 2025. We already have about a dozen plus companies around the world that are also trying to manufacture and get models off the line. So hypothetically, let's say by 2030, 5 years from now, you have 20 to 50 companies that can produce between 10,000 to a million robots a year, scalability wise. What is that going to do for various industries, from agriculture to factory workers, call centers, etc.? I'm not saying that everyone's going to be having no jobs. I think that's going to be much longer down the road, depending on if we get to singularity. But what I am saying is there's going to be massive disruption, and it's going to be quite quick. I think governments and countries around the world needed to be taking this quite seriously. A lot of reports actually already came out from the UK. I remember, I think it was last year, they broke a report that said that, and don't quote me on this, I need to get the numbers, but it was right between 6 to 10% of individuals in the UK are not going to have a job by the end of 2027, right? And this distribution is going to be quite troublesome. And the third one is the social constructs and the ethical conditions of this. This is a really heavy conversation, because now we're talking about how humans and what robots are going to be doing, when, where, and why. And from the starting point, it will be more from a safety standpoint. So doing construction work in dangerous locations that humans shouldn't be, sewage. But eventually, would you have a robot doctor treat you,
I think,
right?
perfectly honest, I think I would, depending on what use case it is. Like, say, if I just want to get checked that I have a fever so I can get the right medicine. Sometimes just having a quick, check and it doesn't look serious. They think robots can definitely suit that, role. And by the way, when I say robot chair, I'm just thinking of like a pod. You sit in with a pod and it literally just has like diodes around and it can just like little bit like jab into you, get some electrodes and kind of like get some base information, which is, it might sound quite expensive, but you do stuff with gym scales like this already, and you just tweak it for medicine. And I think you get, thermometer, you get your heart rate, all of that kind of information. And then from that, it could hopefully give you a very basic diagnosis. And that's low risk. You can maybe have a
Is it? Well,
maybe
think from a security standpoint. Think about being PROPEDA compliant or HIPAA compliant. Now you have to make sure that machine can't be hacked depending on where you have it. And that's a lot of people's sensitive information depending on what you're going from. So from a security standpoint, I see a lot of risk with that depending on who's holding this data.
I think that you're always going to have risk. It's one of those things. But I do think if you think of like the what that's going to do, it's going to free up doctors, so doctors can actually focus on the more harder cases. And say if one person's coming in, because like the UK, we do have a lot of people that use NHS system and maybe abuse it to a certain degree, and that will just help alleviate some of that issues. You just have people
Mm.
funneling in, and you kind of then have a way to accurately record all this information. And again, it's just to make the doctors' lives better, because if you can have one doctor looking and imagine, I know this might sound very horrible to a few people, but imagine the doctor working from home and can get your blood type, your blood pressure, your heart rate, if you've got a fever, give you prescriptions, but he's not doing you, he's doing like 20 other people within an hour instead of like that one person an hour. So you get these magnitudes of like output, and hopefully you're not sacrificing on quality. So I'm just saying, like, I think,
Would you even need a doctor for that? Because
I,
like
I think
just recently they've already shown that a lot of AI can surpass a lot of doctors in many sectors and fields.
Yeah, but see, this is where it comes in. Like, I think we were talking about this the other day. What is AI generally? It's a probabilistic model, is essentially what it is. So it does get stuff wrong. And
Well,
it,
you have a human side, have that doctor, like you said, but he's just confirming the results essentially. But then, is that just not like a glorified like person on a factory line? We're making sure results are done.
well, I think it all depends what is every
It
individual.
would take 10 years to sit there to validate what a robot thinks.
Well, think about this way: you could have rotations because, like, not all doctors maybe want to just see patients; they maybe want to do other stuff too. So now you can do only 2 days of just GP work, and the other 3 days you could use to maybe specialize or upskill to other things to help different case scenarios.
Research, building cool shit,
Yeah.
right?
So I think again, it's the possibilities are kind of limitless, but it's just how do you leverage human skills to get more out of it? That's how I
So
see it.
it's the time allocation. So basically, what you're proposing is what every and is taking using AI, allowing each sector and industry a relevant for lawyers, doctors, accountants, freeing up their time so they're no longer doing the mundane, monotonous, repetitive work that doesn't need any critical thinking, any directions or guidance. Relatively, it's just repetitive nonsense, essentially, to them in their own respective work, and they can now use AI or robotics to do that mundane work where they can focus themselves on solving bigger pictures or helping more human side, the human centric aspect of it, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And I think I spoke to Kelsey Hightower. This was about last year, and he said something to me that's like stuck in my head. And he's like, AI is going to leverage the human aspect more than anything else. Before this, we focused more on credentials. What did you learn? What you can do? And now it's turning in who are you and what do you do?
Ooh,
You know, so
who are you? I like that.
so I think it's a very interesting world we're entering.
That's fascinating because like I always think about like money. Money just only amplifies who you truly already are. So if you're a terrible, awful human being, whether you're rich or poor, it's irrelevant. So it might be fascinating to say to tie into what you're saying there is how is AI going to amplify human beings?
That's a very good point. I think we all like to do the fear mongering and think the worst. I think AI is going to help a lot of people, hopefully give people the freedom to actually focus on what they're passionate about. I think it is going to be a bit of a trial and dance period that we're going to go through. I think some people like looked at, was universal income, and studies coming back from that are not as great as people are hoping. But
Actually, just to clarify on that, if you want to do any more research, maybe we can add a clip below. But I think it was just yesterday or a few days ago, so in July, end of July, Freeberg won the Sultan of Science on the All In podcast. He probably did the best breakdown, simplified breakdown I have ever heard of basically why UBI can't work. So if you want to, we can clip that in. I think that's the best explanation I've heard from anyone articulate why it doesn't work.
yeah, but it kind of makes sense because if you think about yourself, you need purpose in life. And some people certainly don't want to, if they could just lie and relax, they wouldn't do anything. And I think it's not maybe, I'm not saying everyone's like this, but we also got this herd mentality bred into it.
Wally's a movie for a reason.
Well, he's probably a very good identification like that. I think it's more what is like everyone around you doing. And I think imagine you're the only one that wants to do something and everyone else is not. And you kind of become this odd sheep. And to kind of fit in, you stop doing things. And it's kind of like
Mm.
this comes you back where most people didn't actually do more with universal income. They actually did less. And I think that was kind of like bit alarming, but we can definitely look into that in a different conversation. Just thought it was an interesting
Well,
point.
I think we also look at, and one of the ideas that they also had at the Ellen podcast, but I kind of took it from a different standpoint. They talked about giving every American when they're born a trust fund, essentially. So when they're born, they're given a certain amount. So put it in the S&P, and by the time they're able to retire, that weight has been lifted. They don't have that pressure that they need to build a pension fund, or they need to work in the government to have a pension because most companies don't have pensions anymore. So in Canada here, we have something called LIRAs, locked in retirement saving, or locked in RSPs, or LIRA, locked in registration accounts. There we go. The same thing as a pension. You shove it in there, and hopefully, if you pick correctly, you'll have something by the time you retire. And one of the ideas that I was thinking is a little bit different is why don't we also just have insurance on everyone? The country invests in each child when they're born, put life insurance on them, and heaven forbid, in the event any point in time throughout their life, this funeral is paid for, and any extra, which is cash free, probate free, creditor free, essentially, is passed on to the family, essentially, like whoever the next of kin is, essentially, and that passes on generational wealth over time. Right, so there's many avenues and that countries could potentially go down, thinking of different ways of creating that snowball effect without taking that purpose and fulfillment away from people.
I think there's so many different ways there's so many hoops to jump through. Also, it's like just to pass some of these laws because generally people with power don't want some of that stuff to go through. And again, with robotics coming through, most of that policies and that was to keep the population in control. If you think about it, happy. But now imagine you've got this independent force that's not affected by what's happening like in the country. Now you can push policies that are more radical than ever, and you've got this essentially a kind of police force that can protect you 24/7 and hopefully doesn't get hacked, but kind of is indifferent. So I think we're definitely entering an interesting time. I don't want to go down the doomsday saying, but I'm just saying like there's a very fine line we all have to walk.
Well, just to lean into that, in the Web3 space, one of the biggest doomsday thing is central bank digital currencies. And these are basically dystopian tokens that allow governments for totalitarian control of anyone who basically is part of this scheme, essentially. And one of the fascinating things was that recent Bitcoin convention, President Trump was there basically saying that if he becomes president again, that he would make sure that central bank digital currencies will never happen, because it's really is interesting who wants it and who doesn't. And I thought that was fascinating that he was willing to publicly admit something like that, which most politicians try to avoid, because it was one of the clearest and easiest way for countries to take control.
I still think there'll be some form of it coming through. But
Oh yes, oh yes, it's not stopping. There's too many people with power that want this to be a reality.
I think it's just it all depends on humans always do what they feel like suits them best, and that's just how things always evolve. But yeah, I think we're coming up to time. Is there any last snippets of like wisdom that you've seen in the last 2 weeks that you would like to leave, or an idea for someone to go down and dig more into?
I think the biggest thing that I want people to consider is to be preventative versus reactive. And the best way to think about that is there's a funny catchphrase, ignorance is bliss. I think it needs to be updated to ignorant is chaotic bliss, because beforehand you could do the ostrich bias and stick your head in the sand and ignore what's happening in the world and still move on standard quo and have no relevance to your day-to-day life to various degrees, obviously, depending on where you live in the world. But that's no longer the case, irrelevant of where you live in the world. If you don't start gaining conscious competency and really taking your head out of the sand, you're going to have a very harsh awakening in the coming years, unfortunately. And I'm sure you're probably already experiencing the effects. So that's my biggest thing, is accept the laws of cause and effect and really start thinking about being a preventative mindset. Because interesting enough, the Navy SEALs motto is, the 6 P's: proper preparation prevents piss poor performance. And I think sometimes it's necessary to do that in when the world is turning at rates that is unprecedented. It's time to build a plan and execute.
I think I think I'm definitely on board with you there. You can't turn your head away and expect this all to go away. It's moving fast, and if you less prepared you are, the more you're just going to be taken up by the current, and you might not come up to the surface again. So, no, I agree with you.
Ride that technological wave, right?
You see, it's not just the technology wave. It's like one of the impacts you can control around you, because you don't have to be tech focused. You can make certain connections or certain business arrangements to get you further than we are now. And it's just about understanding who the right people to talk to and how to position yourself. That's literally how I see it.
So it's the intent of where you direct your time.
Correct. Yeah. But I think this has been a great session, Ken. Thanks for the chat, and we'll do this again in about 2 weeks.
Sounds good. Peace. We need an outro. That's what we need.